Much, Marge. Nice to know we have some in the area, isn't it?
Well done.
Right.
Now I'm going to turn over everything to Pat, who's a quilt historian and, as you know, volunteer here at Grant Cottage. And she's going to get more into the nitty-gritty of Civil War quilts. Pat?
Okay, and I have to apologize. I am a self-taught historian.
Oh.
And Civil War reenactor, self-taught there too. So if anybody would want to argue over many of my facts, go for it. And I have some more Civil War era, and I have an 1820s quilt here that we can take up and hold. And then I would like you to all be able to come up and see them in person if you want. Can we get this sucker going?
Put it like that.
It would start with a blue whole cloth quilt. You got it. Okay, that'll move it. All right. Okay.
You
might want to take pictures.
Yeah.
Might be easier to stand in those dresses.
Is that yours? There's two chairs here. You can sit there.
Surely, I'll let you.
Okay, I'm just going to go through a very quick history of American quilting, just so we can kind of place the Civil War in that perspective. Keep going, there you go. Quilting, like everything else in the world, has its, its fads. And sometimes we think something's old, and something else might be older because it's a fad. Starting off, when you study history, and I'm studying Civil War history a lot, and I'm studying quilt history a lot, you find out there are myths. Yeah. Myths on myths. I mean, like we all know U.S. Grant was a falling down drunk, right? He went around like this. Oh. And it has been, historians and revisionists have tried to change that image for years. And nobody will believe it, even though Joe Blow, third person, said, I heard Grant was drunk at Shiloh. And somebody said, I was there and he was sober. Well, I heard he was drunk. I was there and he was sober. And you know, who do we believe? The louder of the two. So quilts are fads too. Our quilts are mythologically true. And here's an example. How many of you have been told that that quilts were invented by the American colonists who patched all their clothes together? Okay, well, that's myth number one. Quilting was back before the colonists, even patchwork, but it wasn't that popular. The popular kind was they made them out of whole cloth. And cloth was so relatively expensive. Now we're talking maybe 1750s. In 1750s is about as far back as we can go because they don't last that long. But going back that far, this would have been the quilt on the bed. And well, you know, the definition of a quilt, they go back to ancient China and they were clothing. And the definition is a piece of cloth, and a filler stitched together. And clothing to keep warm. And then in the Renaissance or the Iron Age, you would keep it to keep arrows out of you. And then in 1300 something, we have a guy saying in his diary, I had a dressmaker, seamstress, make me a quilt, and it was no doubt whole cloth. Well, why is it so fancy? Why didn't they just cross hatch it and be warm? The thing of it is, this item shows off that he's somebody important. Either his wife or a seamstress can spend all that time making fancy, fancy decor. And they were fancy. Who had them? Well, in the colonies, if anything's older than quilting, it's taxation. So Linda Seward's book out there on the table says she did some studying of what the colonists had in their homes. How can she do that? Well, they taxed people in the colonies by what they owned. So there's lists of what your households contain. So what does she find out? Only the well-to-do have quilts. Everybody else had a wool blanket. The people who were well-to-do in colonial times tended to be the sea captains and the merchants. So let's put together the colonists inventing patchwork quilts. They were doing whole cloth. Kind of after that, well, here's another one, a fancy counterpane, but it is still a whole cloth. And this one's dated 1794. Okay, after that, the fad kind of went to this. The French were making a very beautiful chintz fabric with big roses and big leaves and so forth. And it was still expensive, so they took a cheaper piece of cloth and appliqued the cut out and appliqued the shapes on there. And this became the popular tree of life in the late 1700s. And after a while, the French got smart. They started making calico meant to be cut up. The next phase, and we're still around late 1700s, early 1800s, is the medallion quilt. They still aren't thinking blocks. Like what do we do with a quilt today? Where's my quilt? What do we mean by, for those of you who are not quilters, okay, when we make a quilt today, we make a block, we make another block, we make another block, you sew them together, you make a bunch of blocks, you sew them together, and so forth till you get your quilt. They still weren't thinking that way. You can set it there, maybe. They were thinking, take the medallion and put borders around it. Now this one was made by Martha Washington, and Martha Washington could have certainly said, she had 200 slaves, she certainly could have said, slave, make me a quilt. But she didn't. She, according to her family, sewed this herself. So it kind of illustrates something that's going to happen in the quilting area of the Civil War time and Victoriana, which is women were valued for their needlework skills. And women thought you had to have needlework skills. So Martha was right into that as early as whenever she made this quilt. I think it was in the early 1800s that it was made by her. And you see that she at least used blocks. They're not all that piece, but they are blocks. So that was the medallion phase, and that lasted probably right through the 1800s. What does this have to do with Civil War? We're getting there. Whoops, let's go backwards. The blocks, well, let's talk about the American quilt now. Cotton became king. Between 1820 and 1850, cotton became the best thing you could make money on if you were a southern farmer. Up in the north, all these rivers in New England, the best thing you could make money on was having a mill for weaving cotton. American cotton is going to change the face of quilting. By 1850, cotton had gone down to 8 to 10 cents a yard. Now, poor people could afford to quilt. Now your dress scraps come into play because you're rich enough to own 2 dresses, one to go to church in and one to work around the house in. And your husband can have 2 shirts and your kids can have 2 sets of underwear and, you know, all these dress scraps. So here is where we get this idea that poor people are making patchwork quilts, okay? But you still have the rich people alive and well making things like this. Does anybody know what that is? Or do you all know what it is? Baltimore album. Baltimore album quilts went from 1846, I think, to 1854 in the Baltimore area. They are scrap quilts, but they are planned scrap quilts. They are gorgeous. We think, and there's all kinds of research, and nobody really has the whole story, that you bought your kit from a dressmaker and put your album together, your squares together, and each woman would make a square, sign it, date it, that kind of thing. And a number of these quilts have survived. So you still have, I want to call it hoity-toity quilts. You see, quilts has gotten so popular with the cheaper cotton, and cotton is a good cloth to use for quilts, that probably during the 1840s or 50s, your mother quilted, your aunt quilted, your sister quilted, your cousin quilted, You quilted? I mean, everyone quilted. It was the acme of quilting. So by 1850, did you ever stop and think that American quilters helped cause the Civil War? But the demand for cotton was right up there. 60% of the products shipped out of the exports out of New York City were cotton to England. England was eating it up and in direct competition with the northern United States for making cloth. So some of this cloth might have come from England. Beautiful stuff. During this period, this Victorian period, everything is symbolic. You know, they loved symbols. They loved presentations. They would make quilts to present, say the minister was leaving, they'd make him an album quilt. They would make a quilt for what they called a freedom quilt. A young man might be turning 21, and in those days you had to work for your dad until you were 21. You had to give him all your money. But after that, you could walk right out of his life if you wanted to and make your own way. And hey, mom made you a quilt. When he was 21, mother made him a quilt. They had bride quilts. They had groom quilts. If any of you have time later, I have a collection of antebellum quilts in a book out there in the table of books that has all of these examples of them. They're political quilts. We think that, oh, women can't vote, but they can express themselves politically. But here's another wrinkle to it. Our letter writer said, my husband is giving a wig rally next month, and he wants me to make a wig quilt. So it was also, you know, following the lead of the husband in that case. But Bible quilts, you name it, they were there. See if I get this right. Okay, the mourning, M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G quilt, you know. There aren't a lot of these, and I don't know why we don't have more, because mourning quilts, it's very therapeutic to work on a quilt. This lady thought that she put the caskets with the names on it around the edge, and then when you died, into the cemetery you went, in the center. So that was one of the better lasting mourning quilts that we have. Here we get to talk about the pop holder quilt. I always want to call it popcorn. That's the pop holder. I studied quilts for years and never heard of this phenomenon until this one book comes out that describes the pot holder. What they did was they made the square, bound the square, quilted the square, then came back to the Ladies' Aid Society and whip-stitched it together, and what you get is the whip-stitched edging becomes the sashing strip to separate the blocks. And this is an example of a pot holder quilt. Here's an example of the first block, if you want to finish the rest of it for me. What Diane talked about, the Sanitary Commission quilts, they asked the Ladies' Aid Societies, who often turned into Soldier Aid Societies, to make quilts to order and get them out as fast as they could. And so this would have been an example probably of one that they would auction off in their sanitary fair or whatever. But they also would make them for the soldiers. This one that I showed, where to go? Yeah, is about the size that you would see for a soldier's quilt. Now, the Union soldier did not carry much in the way of quilts. He preferred blankets. They were issued to him. He was issued wool blankets. His quilts, he might have carried it for a while to be polite, but the wool blanket was more practical. The Southerners, however, okay, I guess you could put it away now. The Southerners did not have wool, so they gave their men for a while quilts until they ran out, and then they said, you get what you can get. And what they usually did was say, wife, send me a quilt, and you already had one letter saying that, or they'd cut up the rug, or they'd take it off a Union soldier. So that was the, if you see reenactments and a Southern soldier is carrying a quilt around his body, that is absolutely accurate. Okay, the thing that happens now, Dear Jane is going to illustrate something for us. Have you all seen that quilt in Bennington?
Yeah.
Masterpiece. So the Dear Jane is going to illustrate to us that what happened to quilting during the Civil War. Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, did something that he thought was smart, and it turned out to be a terrible mistake. He decided to starve the world of Southern cotton so they join forces and help defeat the Union armies. So he took cotton off the market. He told his people not to raise it, to raise food for the armies. He then burned bales of cotton, let them rot in the bale, pretty well closed down the shipping of cotton. Later on, the blockade would help that by getting more strong and shutting down the whole southern port. But this was an early thing on Jefferson Davis's part. What happened? It totally ruined the economy of the South. England and France went to, and other European countries went to other places for their cotton. They went to India, they went to Egypt. To this day, the United States has never gotten that cotton back, or that cotton market back. So he bankrupted his country by his actions. And it wasn't all his fault. He had a Congress helping him. But anyway, what do you see about those quilts that we know of in the Civil War? Mostly scrap quilts. We can't get enough to make a blue and white quilt anymore. We have to make it 4 or 5 or 12 or 15 colors. And Jane's quilt certainly illustrates that. She has used scraps to every advantage and has gotten them. I don't think there is one print in there that's not. They're all not alike, aren't they? I haven't found any that I could say was really not alike. Okay.
We have an example of a modern one on the other side of the porch.
Yes, we have an example, and I have a reproduction top that I've made, and oh, Lord knows when I'll get it finished. But okay, let's look at some of the Civil War quilts.
She's the one who made the
No, they're all
It's in a museum.
Yeah, they're, what size are those blocks?
What size were the blocks? 5.5
They're not very big. They're what size are the blocks?
I think it's like 5.5.
They're 4.5-inch blocks, I know. This is an 1824 quilt. Now in 1824, we're just getting over medallions, we're just getting over strippy quilts that are made from strips. We're just getting over all that stuff, and this is an early block quilt. I was told by an appraiser it's 1820s, I'm not arguing with him. It's an Ohio Star, and I think it's doggone pretty. Now it does have a chambray, a blue chambray binding, so obviously the binding is modern. The binding chambray came into effect around 1900, so they had to change the binding out. But other than that, this is a pretty nice quilt. I know nothing about it other than that. I don't know. We'll have to try it. Okay, this is an 1850s quilt. You will notice that the black is eaten away and everything else is all right. Black was one of the cottons that didn't do well in quilts up until 1890s. They kept trying different mordants because black would fade or turn color. The mordant is what you soak it in after you color it. And the mordant is supposed to set it. And they just didn't get a good black for a long, long time. And you notice the crazy quilts are eaten away. That's from the mordant that they used to make the silk rustle. It was like a shellac. So that was the story of this quilt. You do not, this is a typical color of Civil War quilts. Honey, browns, some double pinks. So some plaid scrap, but this was typical. And you very seldom see a quilt in the Civil War era that was primarily black. Even the, we can bump that now. Even the Amish quilters were usually, at this period, making whole cloth. They had not made their famous Amish with the different colors. And in fact, if you do see an Amish quilt and it says it's an antique, I have yet to see one before 1900 that was what we think of as the Amish style today. Yeah.
Were a lot of these antique quilts, just a solid piece on the back?
Yeah, but you'll find people did what they had to do. Yeah, this is a solid muslin, but they did what they had to do. I have a quilt at home. I have a collection at home of about 20 quilts, and one of them is sugar sacks, and she bleached them and to fade them and sewed them together. It's a brown, it's a blue and red quilt and a black and red quilt. She combined two strips to make one quilt, and I figure the date on it is about 70s or 80s, 1870s or 1880s, maybe later. But whatever they had, they would put an old quilt inside sometimes.
Now, where did you acquire these quilts?
All over. My sister-in-law was a antique dealer, and she gave me a few of them, thinking I was going to refab them. I haven't yet. I have yet to repair them. And every now and then, when I see one, my rule of thumb in an antique shop is no more than $50 or something like that, because you'll spend that in a quilt shop. So I figure I was entitled. And generally speaking, if you get an antique dealer that really isn't that sure what they have, or they think it's been modernized, like the 1824 quilt, it was a quilt shop, it was an appraiser, and she said, doesn't look valuable to me, so it just looks old. So I just acquired them when the price was right.
Okay.
This one is one of the better ones in the collection. It illustrates the madder being a purplish reddish, and it was very popular during the Civil War period. These set strips are what we call neats, N-E-A-T-S. They are little prints of flowers that were real cheap to make, so they cranked these out, and the Southern ladies liked them for their dresses. You will see here that there are little dots that we call picotage, and we'll leave these out for you to kind of take a peek at later. And the picotage, these little dots, once they learned to roller print, now block printing goes on till mid-70s, going on late 70s, and then they discovered roller printing. Block printing made beautiful fabric because they block printed over and over on the piece, but block printing was very slow, and the roller printing could do the same thing in 1/15 of the time. So roller printing was in, and they loved to put little bumps on their roller print and make these picotages. It's typical of a Civil War era cloth. You don't see it that much today, but picotage is very popular in the Civil War. This, you will notice, is T-shaped. Why is it T-shaped? The bedpost. It went over the bedpost, yeah.
Oh, okay.
These serpentines, they were very popular. They called them eccentrics. They loved them. Most of these fabrics are darn typical of the Civil War. Okay, well, who we got left here? Do the little one. Well, it's mostly brown, isn't it? But we've got some black. Yeah, there is more black in it, but this is pretty much an 1850s quilt. So somehow that fabric didn't rot, but it was given to me as an 1850s. The funny thing is the brown's going. And once again, they were experimenting with mordant to set the color. And it was an ongoing process. By the Civil War, you're not using vegetable dyes that much. Madder was a vegetable dye, and they would use that. But the vegetable dyes fade. You start with a green and you end up with a brown. It goes back to what the tree goes back to in the spring, in the fall, I guess. So they knew that chemical dyes were necessary, and they were coming along fine. Most dyes in the Civil War were chemical, but they hadn't got their mordants right, and often it ate the cloth away in a few years. Stencil quilts were very popular in the 1840s, and they were using barn paint, and it ate the fabric, so that period went down real fast.
That's, part of the.
Yeah, that'll do it. The last one will be. This one I throw in because it illustrates history, but I really am not sure what to call it date-wise. You look at it and say, well, it's a strippy quilt. Well, strippies were before blocks. Well, they must have done the strippy before the Civil War or something like that. However, it's a pink quilt. You just don't see pink quilts in the Civil War. I don't know why they had pink fabric, but this has got what they call diaper fabric because of the geometric and neats. And is there any picotage? Yeah, there's a little picotage in it. But still in all, my hunch tells me this is about 1870. It does have a machine sewn binding. Now machine sewing, the Civil War made the sewing machine very popular. They estimate that 60% of these small quilts made for the troops were made on and quilted with a sewing machine. Isaac Singer, Mr. Smarty Pants, the marketer, he was about the fourth person to market a machine since the 1840s, but he got it right. He gave them to ministers' wives. Now, if the minister's wife has got one, it's got to be all right. The minister was preaching things like, you don't want your wife to have a sewing machine, why she won't have a thing to do, so she'll run around. And then the guys were saying, yeah, I didn't want to pay for one anyway. So he gives them to the minister's wives, saying, let your ladies' aid societies try this out. He did the pay as you go, pay $1 down, $1 a week for a year, $50 for a sewing machine. He really sold those suckers, and the need for all those 25,000 quilts or whatever it was that the Sanitary Commission was swooping up became added to the thing too. So sewing machines were very popular. Okay. And that guy right there.
Yeah, a question here.
Yes, ma'am.
That quilt looks very thin. Is there any batting in it?
Uh-huh. There
pink
is,
one.
and it's very
Pink
thin.
one.
The pink one? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, there is, and they made them very thin. That's another characteristic of...
What did they use?
What's the name? Mountain Mist came out in 1846, I'm going to say, 44 or 46.
Oh.
So they could use that. They could use homegrown. In the South, you do find them taking it out of the garden. It might still have the seeds in it. But I think a lot of them were buying their batting then. Now, of course, poorer folks would probably put anything in it, maybe a blank, old worn out blanket, and then you'd have to tie it. Or another quilt that was worn, and then you'd have to tie it. So whatever they could find, but the cotton batting is your most common. Okay. This one comes from Saratoga area. I got it in an antique shop too. It illustrates, to me anyway, the Civil War quilt idea that you made scraps, but didn't they do a beautiful job? Yeah, I'd love to finish it someday. Some of this, I've been told, some of it's 1840s, I think perhaps that is, but it's very typical of what they were doing. Let me talk a little bit about what happens after the Civil War. After the Civil War, cotton got so expensive that quilting got to be difficult to do. And what's going to happen is they fell out of fashion. The newer generation said, I don't want quilts like that. Poor people make those. So we get into what I call the era of the useless quilt. That would be your, right here, your crazy quilt that is very embellished. They did not embellish their quilts during the Civil War. They were more practical items. But the yo-yo quilts, you get into your Sunbonnet Sue. She came about because of Kate Greenaway in 1870, who featured illustrations of a kid with a bonnet and no face. I can take this hand, though, and tell you what quilts didn't exist before 1850, what patterns. They did so much quilting in that era that they discovered everything we think we've discovered. They already had it. They did not have Dresden plate. They did not have double wedding ring. They did not have grandmother's fan. I already said Sue didn't have sunbonnet. Sue, I'm running out of it already that they did not have before the Civil War, that the ones that came out afterwards. Let me show you my version. We're talking about the history of quilting, okay? And it had another resurgence during the Depression for some reason. Almost every magazine or newspaper would have little quilt pattern features. Paragon Quilts put out kits. It's really kind of mysterious that at a time when people didn't have jobs, women were making quilts. But they were. And then it died down in World War II and almost disappeared. I mean, it was hard to get good cotton, etc. About 1976, they decided to honor the past, and quilting started a boom. And then somebody came up with this. For those of you who don't quilt, this is not a pizza cutter. You can take your cloth, you can take your acrylic ruler, and you go bloom, 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 bloom. Whereas your great-grandmother took a piece of cardboard square, and she made a square, and a square, and a square, and cut up with, leaving a seam allowance. You can do what she did in an hour that took her probably 2 days. Yeah, so that's pretty much the story of quilting. It's a $4 billion industry. It's really here to stay for now. I would like to show you this one. This is my version of the James Stickles quilt. But how many have seen the original? Were you impressed? Yes.
Shelburne, yeah.
Yeah, they show it, in Bennington. No, not Shelburne, it's in Bennington. Bennington Museum. And they take it out from Labor Day to Columbus Day.
Yeah.
And it has its own room, and you go in there. It is a masterpiece. I did the blocks like hers were. I have not set on them like she does, made in wartime, 1862. I've got to say something different. Of course, I'm a long way from having it quilted yet, but it's a masterpiece of scrap quilting. So that's kind of the story of American quilting and how it pertains to the Civil War, and then some, okay? Is there any more questions that you have?
Pat?
Yeah.
I just had a comment. I know that in my research on prisoners of war during the Civil War period, that your quilt could actually save your life. If you were imprisoned in an open air prison like Andersonville or Camp Ford, which was in Tyler, Texas, if you didn't have some sort of covering, you would perish from the elements. And many times in the accounts, memoirs that former prisoners left, they said the
quilt saved their life. Yeah. Andersonville was not allowed to have buildings. They had no buildings, so you lived outdoors. And they put anything up to break the sun. And if they didn't have their tent, how many captured men would have their tent? They certainly would have used their quilt or their blankets. Yeah, yeah, very good. Anything else? Well, do you want to talk about the crazy quilt?
It wasn't mine. One of the ladies in the crowd brought it in.
Oh, all right. Okay.
I brought it, but I know nothing about it.
All right. Yeah, I'm that way with my quilts.
It belongs in the family, and a gal, Kathy Greenwald, helped me to refurbish it by putting on the fresh ribbons where it was beginning to fray, and she said that it was probably Civil War era.
Well, it would be older than that.
Older than that?
Yeah, Civil War did not embellish, and they did not do that.
But I love
this
all
would
the
be the
embroidery.
era when quilting was falling out of favor, and people were still wanting you to know they were good needlewomen.
Yes.
And they still,
Early 1900s, they did a lot of embroidery.
yeah, 1880s to 1910 maybe, yeah,
1920s.
right, yeah.
1920s was pretty much the end of crazy quilt.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And you didn't put that on your bed, you put that over your horsehair sofa. That part of that era of the useless quilt, I'm gonna show off my skills, but I don't want a quilt on my bed. You know, Mrs. Vanderbilt probably has an embroidered counterpane. So that would be, it is a gorgeous example, really is.
Thank you.
And I think, Marge, did we leave out your quilt back here? Is this your?
Yeah,
Okay.
yes, it is.
This
Did
is,
that get shown? Okay, once again, the blue and white craze was usually in the 1850s, usually. Now, could have made one last week, but it was really big in the 1850s. I have no clue what you call that pattern.
That one I think is dated 1850.
Pardon?
I think that was dated 1850.
1850?
Yeah.
Yep.
Beautiful shape. But you see that people think that quilts were all the poor people covering up. And yes, a lot of them were, but also women were putting a lot of pride into a quilt. That probably spent most of its life in a dresser or it wouldn't look that good. Oh, there's the signature. All right. And it is 1850, Dorothy. George Wright, Dorothy. Okay. Okay.
you're welcome to look at the quilts afterwards. Thank you very much.